of the important things that these commentators who've written these studies on how we get out have seemed to have missed is something called vested rights. And this is an EU doctrine which rests on EU citizenship and something called legal heritage. And you will remember in 1992, under the Treaty on European Union, we were all made citizens of the European Union, including our head of state, Her Majesty the Queen. Now, this in the Bill of Rights, it actually says there can be no higher authority than the Crown in Parliament, and yet that Crown in Parliament was subjugated to the European Union as a citizen. How can your head of state be a citizen of somewhere else? But anyway, that's an argument that's in this book, and we show how that was actually unlawful at the time. But never mind, we were all made citizens of the European Union. And they have rights, which are vested rights, which means that if we did leave the European Union, under Article 50, the EU can write into that all the rights given to European citizens who came here while that we were members, all businesses, all institutions or whatever, have those rights protected in perpetuity. It could mean that anybody who was alive in Europe while up until the date we withdraw, also had those vested rights. Now, of course, we've got quite a lot of people here, 1 million people, 2 million people, we don't know for certain, who've come from the European Union over the years, and certainly many, many people from 2004. Now, we're not saying in UKIP that they'd all have to leave the country, but I do recommend a way of how we would deal with this, which is that if people have come, they have employment or a business, they pay taxes, they obey the law, then of course we would grant them a permanent right to remain, or a work permit, and they can eventually apply for citizenship. But even people who don't work, don't pay taxes, break the law, we would be powerless to actually require them to leave. That's what vested rights mean, and this is very, very important, because we could find, if we try to leave under Article 50 and whatever package we finally are allowed to leave under, that all of these things are protected, and we would actually no longer be we still wouldn't be any more independent than Norwegian or Switzerland. We'd still have to pay tribute to the EU, we'd still have to pay, say, 25% of their laws, we would still have to have open borders, and a whole raft of other things would affect us. We would still not be an independent country. And indeed, the EU foresaw this, that there would be countries who may not be ready to join, who they may not consider worthy of joining at that point, and they have this thing called concentric circles, which mean you've got the core EU countries, and you've got other countries which are kind of not quite in the EU, but not independent either. It's like a way that an empire dominates states which it hasn't yet absorbed into its empire. Now, there will be a great old legal battle about this, I'm sure, and give lots of employment to people. And of course, at the end of the day, if we left under Article 50, who would be the decision maker about what applied and what wouldn't apply? Go on, guess. It's going to be the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights. It isn't going to be our own Parliament and our own courts. Again, we'll be subject to their decisions. And as I said, what do the exponents of Article 55 envisage? It is something along the Swiss or the Norwegian model, which I said to you is not desirable in the first place. I actually did enter I made an entry to the Brexit prize, which didn't even get through to be considered, and it didn't get through for a very good reason. I was the only one of the entrants to that competition that rejected Article 50 at the outset and laid out the plan for unilateral, unconditional withdrawal. So my entry wasn't even considered, which doesn't matter because then I got published by Rupert, which is much better anyway. Now, let me say something about the referendum in Scotland, because whatever you think about Alex Salmond or the SNP, he was actually very effective. He turned round, like I think it was something like a 20 points against him, and narrowed it so much so that we saw the political elite in this country panicking when they thought they were going to lose it a day or two before the election. He was very, very effective. He didn't win in the end, and I think one of the big criticisms that was levelled at him was that he didn't have a plan. And that was obvious when it came to things like what currency they were going to use, which of course wouldn't affect ours because that's not an issue. But he was criticised for not having a plan. So therefore I think it's very important that those of us that want to leave the European Union, the withdrawalist cause, actually do have a plan. And I think it's very important that we reject Article 50, because if we get sucked into this, it's the biggest mistake that we can make. Because what you're doing is you're asking your opponent to set the terms of your surrender before the fight has even begun. So how do we leave? I describe a plan in my book, and let me summarise it first for you. First of all, we repeal the European Communities Act 1972 and restore the supremacy of Parliament and of our own law. We stop all payments to the EU budget. Now, all EU directives have already been transposed into our Acts of Parliament, because people will say, you can't do it, there'll be chaos, there's all these 25,000 or however many hundreds of thousands of pages of the Acquis Communautaire EU law that there are. It'd be absolute chaos. Well, no, they wouldn't, because if they're law in the UK, they've had to be transposed into Acts of Parliament, which of course is the main function of the Houses of Parliament now, is to actually transpose EU directives. That's what they do all the time. So they would stay in place. But then the British government, who'd freed itself from the supremacy of the EU, could then repeal those acts over a period of time, let's say 2-3 years. Some it would get rid of altogether, some of them it would amend because it might be legislation that we want to keep. But the point is, it would be our legislation that we chose in our own